Do you remember your first thought or feeling upon seeing a liminal space photo? Maybe it's difficult to recollect specifics, but I know that I remember remembering. When the liminal space fad really took off, I was so incredibly interested because I somehow felt like I genuinely remembered some of them. Whether it was a vague childhood memory or a dream, it gave me a sense of belonging and knowing. You probably either relate to that or you thought they were freaky as hell, because based on personal experience, people seem to fall in those two categories. Those who love these images that I consider an art form, and those that find them creepy and unsettling. Why is that? What is it about these pictures that evoke such emotion in us? What's the history behind them, and how do they relate to our everyday lives, nostalgia, and the media we consume? Let's deep dive into it. The word liminal comes from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold, any point or place of entering or beginning. A liminal space is the time between the what was and the next. It is a place of transition, a season of waiting and not knowing. Now, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with those weird pictures that this video is about? And this is because liminal spaces aren't just the pictures on the internet. They are real things in our lives, and the phrase liminality was coined by anthropologist Arnold van Gennep in 1909. The concept was developed more later on in the 1960s by Victor Turner, another anthropologist. The idea is that there are three rites of passages in the cycles of life. Preliminal, which is the metaphorical death of something, or what was. Liminal being the transition into something else, and postliminal, which is the new being, or what's next. The anthropological liminal spaces are essentially transitional periods in life and society, a sudden event that changes your life, the different life stages, etc. So how does this relate to what the internet knows as liminal spaces? I remember back in 2016 or 17 when liminal spaces were starting to make their way onto the internet, except they weren't called that yet. There was this Tumblr post about how reality feels altered in certain places, like empty parking lots, playgrounds at night, unfamiliar McDonald's on a long road trip, and airports. And with the whole Tumblr grunge era, there was a lot of imagery that related to this in a sense, like depicting this feeling, and I consider this era the beginning. You might realize now that these actually kind of are examples of liminality, like a McDonald's on a road trip is between what was, which is before your trip, and what's next, being your destination. I went back to that post and there is someone explaining that these are examples of liminal spaces and why. However, I don't know what date this was, and this wasn't a part of what I saw years ago. Like, the main post was what I kept seeing and not the liminal explanation. This person does do a great job at explaining liminal spaces, but I don't agree that this is what makes them weird, at least for me. They're saying that because we're not supposed to be in these places for a long time and that they don't really exist outside of that transitional phase, that they don't feel right to us when they're in their own entity, and that humans like context, so if something isn't matching with what context we're already familiar with, it gives us a sense of danger. That explanation totally makes sense, but that's just not it for me. Especially considering this explanation regards those who find them unnerving, not those who find them fascinating. The next stepping stone for the liminal space craze, I would say, was the vaporwave aesthetic in 2018. Now, hear me out, okay? Vaporwave existed before 2018, but this was the year it was a big thing, and I'm not talking about the music, even though that's what it technically is. I'm talking about the vaporwave aesthetic pictures, because look at them. It totally gives like beta liminal space. I think all of these things transitioned into what became the liminal space era of the internet. And over time, the criteria for a photo to be considered liminal expanded, and it basically turned into any picture that just looked weird or nostalgic even. The phrase liminal space wasn't really well known until 2020 when the backrooms became super popular. And the backrooms really solidified this period of time. Despite the original 4chan post being made in May of 2019, I don't think it became like a thing until 2020, and this was when liminal spaces started to be everywhere. David Crypt was trying to solve the backrooms photo was taken, along with all the pictures that feel strangely familiar but are uncomfortable videos. This was when I'd say the peak for liminal spaces was. I had seen those really well-known ones on Instagram, and it intrigued me from the moment I saw them. When I was a young child, I always felt like there was another world in my head and in my memory that I couldn't reach. It's so hard to explain the phenomenon better than that, and it probably was just a really active imagination. I sort of created false memories of a different experience of life or reality, you could say, and I'm probably doing a terrible job of getting across the way I felt, but when I was around 13, I went through this dumb spiritual phase, and I convinced myself that these feelings came from a past life or something. I don't think that's the case at all anymore. In fact, I actually hope reincarnation isn't real. I now think the brain is just such a complex thing, and when you take a developing, impressionable brain that happens to be an imaginative, creative one, you come up with a lot of stuff. But somehow these images evoke that old feeling in me, and some would also make me retrieve real memories from my childhood that I hadn't thought about in years. And if you've watched my other videos, you've probably realized my fondness of nostalgia. There's two things I find weirdly comforting: shit from my childhood and unsettling media. So when you put those things together, you essentially get liminal spaces, because they are for sure derivative of that late 90s and early 2000s vibe, and their intention is usually to be creepy. Maybe the explanation isn't any more deep than that. Truthfully, I don't really think it is, although it's still exciting to entertain possible ideas and theories that relate to our existence and consciousness, even if it is nothing more than just, hey, weird pictures are gonna make you feel weird, but it doesn't make it any less captivating. Another component that I assume makes them so interesting is the dreamlike state that they illustrate. Dreams are just simply cooler than real life. Anything is possible in them, and somehow our minds make them up on their own on the spot as we sleep. I've created entire disturbing horror movies in my dreams that I was a part of, and I've also made up some of the most absolutely pleasant experiences. It's very contrasting, and I never know what to expect before I fall asleep. When I got my wisdom teeth removed and was on hydrocodone for the days following, I had the best dreams ever. I was in so much pain, and being able to eat only mushy stuff depressed me, but the dreams were so nice. There have been some liminal spaces I've come across that look so similar to what I dreamt that it freaked me out for a second upon seeing them. I said earlier how I consider them an art form. They're so compelling to just go through and appreciate, and I've scrolled through r/liminal space countless times to just immerse myself into them, and something even more enjoyable is seeing these types of places in the flesh with your own eyes. Malls and hotels are notable for invoking this feeling. The atmosphere of them can feel otherworldly almost, especially in dead malls. The summer of 2020, when the backrooms were widespread, my friend and I were just driving around aimlessly because there's already not much to do in this shitty town that I live in, but with COVID there was literally nothing, and the summer was when you could finally hang out with one person. And we came across one of those suburban neighborhoods where every house looks the same, except it was under construction and it felt so ominous, in the best way. It was at night, the houses looked somehow off, and there were weirdly placed traffic cones, some blocking off certain exits, and we just loved it. I also went on a trip for my 18th birthday to a city some hours away and made a stop to a retro video game store in a town right outside of the city. And that town was hands down the most liminal thing I've ever had the pleasure to experience. The fast food restaurants weren't the modern versions. They still had their early 2000s architectures. I specifically remember the Pizza Hut being the old version and the Taco Bell having their old logo. There was this freaky playground that just didn't look right. And the ambience was merely hazy and surreal. It was the feeling of coming out of your car after being on a highway for hours, mixed with the town just being a fever dream. And the best part was this faded Sesame Street mural on a building behind the video game store. However, the place was great, one of the best game stores I've been to. I was expecting some sketchy, underwhelming thing, but it was quite the opposite, so it was a nice surprise. While on the topic of games, I wanted to go over some instances in video games that convey liminal spaces very well. I came across a fairly new video while I was researching to assemble the script, honestly, to make sure the subject matter of liminal spaces wasn't completely dead, and it was about movies containing strangely familiar places. It was a great video. I recommend anyone who's interested in this kind of thing to go watch it, but it inspired me to talk about liminal spaces in video games. And if you like weird stuff and video games, you should check out a previous video of mine regarding unused content in Mario games and Conker's Bad Fur Day. Moving on and bringing it back to childhood, I would play around in the Chow Garden in Sonic Adventure 2, and I loved it so much, like I did nothing else in the game. I thought the Chow Garden was an ethereal place and the chows were adorable to me, and looking back, it definitely has a liminal environment. I mentioned in my Super Paper Mario retrospective that when I was little, I would mindlessly walk around in a video game for half an hour and put it down, and the Silent Hill franchise was an example of child me doing that. Nothing scary happened. I literally either just walked around in either the beginning or someone else's save state and didn't progress at all. I have no idea which ones I played because it's such a fuzzy memory, but they all are truly great examples of liminal spaces, as you can see here. Some of the backgrounds in Super Monkey Ball 1 and 2 are definitely worth mentioning. Shout out to Burger Cube, rest in peace Burger Cube, and the creepy sun that were left out in Banana Mania. You will forever be missed. Exploring in Skyrim gives an indescribable feeling as well. I think the majority of people who love Skyrim played non-stop when they first got into it. I have wonderful memories of playing it all night long until the morning and just getting lost into it. Nothing really compares to the specific feel and engagement Skyrim gives you, and the Soul Cairn is quite literally a liminal space, and roaming around gives you the same eerie yet charmingly mesmerizing feel. Mario 64 is probably the most widely talked about example, and it is always mentioned how there's really no one else but Mario in the game, which solitude or an absence of people is a significant element to a lot of liminal spaces. I don't know how many hours of my life have been spent watching 16-star speedrun streams, but it's a lot. And a reason for that, aside from how impressive and fascinating speedruns are, has to be that I find it nice to just watch Mario 64 itself. I enjoy the atmosphere. And even though this is full of characters, the train right at the beginning of Animal Crossing City Folk is ingrained in my head for some reason, and I think it fits being called a liminal space. Like, it's a transition, so of course it does. Some old Flash games are fitting as well. Something as simple as the geometricness of the world's hardest game, with the background music that was also burned into my brain, and I'm sure it's in yours too if you ever try to beat this shit. Run is suitable to bring up, and some years back I got into a point-and-click games phase that lasted only a couple weeks, but the Submachine, Don't Escape, and Alice is Dead series all come to mind. Also, does anyone remember Gaia Online? Like, does anyone have a memory of playing this game in the early 2000s? I played this when I was so young, and I wanted to acknowledge it because I never see anything about Gaia. It was a thing, right? Obviously it was. I actually still exist. I looked it up, although I imagine it's dead now. My whole point to this tangent is I think that's a major part of why I do love video games, how they make you experience different feelings and situations. I guess I like to kind of metaphorically escape to different worlds, and liminal spaces do the same thing because it feels like an altered reality. I assume that's why I don't find them creepy, because I do enjoy feeling like I'm in an altered state or reality. Like, I think I just got to the bottom of it, even if it's not the profound explanation that people want. I think it's just the truth. And I'd love to hear about your own experiences with liminal spaces, whether it's indistinct and fuzzy or very clear and easy to recall, if they're in real life, a dream, a video game, or whatever else, and how they make you feel and why you think they evoke that within you. I hope you enjoyed my analysis and history lesson on liminal spaces and how they relate to the world around us and the psychology within us. Keep a lookout for what's next. Thank you.